Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids, and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're taking a look at cards revealed for the new The Tide Rises expansion coming out July 11th. There will be 6 new cards for each faction, not including neutrals, and today we'll be looking at the Scoia'Tael cards, starting off with this Trap Maker here. This is a 2-power, 4-provision Elf Bandit Soldier, which on deploy will boost itself by 3 for each face-down allied trap. So the new expansion will focus on the Trap archetype, which is of course an archetype that is pretty well established at this stage, but there will actually be some pretty significant changes that we'll talk about in just a minute. The thing that concerns me about this card is that obviously 2 power for 4 provisions is atrocious value, so you really don't want to play this when you have either no traps on the board or when all of your traps have already been triggered. But if you have 1 face down trap, then you're talking 5 power for 4 provisions. That's still not very good. Then 2 face down traps, okay, at that point 8 power for 4 provisions, that's pretty good. Then if you somehow get even more face down traps, you get to 11 power. That seems pretty unrealistic at this point because it's pretty difficult to have a lot of face down traps. For the most part, when you play a trap, it is going to get triggered on your opponent's next turn, with a few exceptions. We can take a look at the deck builder and see things like Mahakam Horn. That's one card you can pretty reliably have remain face down for the entirety of the round. Serpent Trap can stay face down for a fairly long time, but you can't control when your opponent plays their next special card, so that's still risky. And then Crushing Trap can stay down for at least 1 turn, but just about anything else, the Incinerating Trap, the Pitfall Trap, and the Treant Mantis Stalk, those things are almost certainly going to trigger as soon as your opponent plays their next card, so that means it's pretty hard to get good value on this card unless we see additional traps that are easier to keep face down. So for that reason, I am nervous about the Trap Maker. Yes, it does have decent upside, but it just feels like it is too risky to warrant using this all that often. But the Traps archetype is mostly about control, not point slams, so maybe you don't need to score a bunch of points with this if you're destroying most of your opponent's units with traps. And since it's just 4 provisions, it's fine if you just never play it, and since it's a unit and all decks need to have at least 13 units, something that's a little tricky with trap decks, at the very least it's a solid filler card. Then we have Hostage Taker, which is the new rare card. It's a 5-provision, 4-power Elf Bandit Soldier. On deploy, it will seize an enemy unit with 0 or less power, then transform that seized unit into an Elven Deadeye without changing its power. The maximum power is increased by 1 for each trap that you've played this round. So obviously that means initially this is just a 4-power unit for 5 provisions, which obviously is terrible value. However, if, particularly in a long round, you've played a lot of traps, then suddenly that deployability becomes pretty incredible. You can seize a 2 or 3 power unit very easily. Obviously, there won't be that many 2 or 3 power units, but you might be able to do that if something survives an incinerating or pitfall trap. If you start by playing 4 or 5 traps in a round and then playing the Hostage Taker at or near the end of the round, then you can steal a decent unit from your opponent, kind of like Syndicates pulling the strings. Seizing a 4 power unit is on net a minimum 12-point play, and seizing a 5 power unit is a minimum 14-point play. Now, it will transform into an Elven Deadeye. It'll keep the same amount of power that the unit originally had, so you're still maintaining that value, but if, for example, maybe you're sealing an engine or a unit that had an order ability that had not yet been used, you'll still prevent your opponent from benefiting from that, but you're not going to be able to use those yourself because it will transform into that Deadeye, which obviously does not have any ability. But the value from that, if you do manage to play a lot of traps and finish off with a Hostage Taker late on in the round, is pretty awesome, so I think this could be a great addition to a lot of trap decks. Then we have Deception, which is a new trap. It's an epic card at 7 provisions. Ambush timer 3, spawn 3 Elven Deadeyes on this row, or if you manually spring the trap, it'll spawn 2 Elven Deadeyes on this row. So basically, this gives you another trap that you can pretty reliably have remain face down at least for a few turns, making it useful setup for the Trap Maker. And then if you do manually trigger it, then obviously you're getting less value out of it. But there is one significant mechanical change to the way that traps are going to work after this patch, and it's actually a nerf, because it used to be that you only get that spring effect, which is always weaker than the ambush effect, if you manually flip over your traps. However, after this patch, whenever you play a trap next to an artifact, which of course includes other traps, your trap that you play will immediately flip with the spring effect, not the ambush effect. which basically means you're almost never going to want to play two traps right next to each other. Otherwise, your traps will get weaker. The reason behind this change is to discourage players from playing completely unitless for 90% of the round, which is a really frustrating type of deck to play against because there's almost no way for you to interact with your opponent's cards, which in a multiplayer game in which you are usually interacting with your opponent's cards every turn, including damage and control decks that need to do that to get their value, did make traps a very polarizing archetype. So while that change will make it less effective to mindlessly spam traps, hopefully it will encourage players who want to play the trap archetype to use more units that synergize with traps. And that's where Deception gets its value, because spawning 3 Elven Deadeyes is just 9 points, which may not seem great for a 7 provision card, but by spawning in all those units, it makes it much easier for you to play those traps next to a unit rather than an artifact, helping you avoid springing traps when you don't want to. So while Deception may at first glance look underwhelming, it's how it helps you work around that new trap spring mechanic change where it gets its value. Next, we have another new epic trap, Sticky Situation, which is an 8 provision trap. Ambush: when your opponent plays a unit with 4 or less power, flip self. At the end of your turn, boost adjacent units by 2. When your opponent passes while this card is face up, lock self. Spring: boost a unit in your hand by 6, then lock self. Whenever your opponent passes, decrease the boost values by 1. So this trap plays very differently than any other one that we've seen before. In this case, we want to play Sticky Situation as early as possible because it's actually an engine. So if we have 2 units next to this when Sticky Situation flips over, it'll give 2 units 2 boosts for a total of 4 points per turn, which if you get that going early is really good. But that 6-point boost on the spring effect is definitely significantly worse, unless you're at the very end of the round when you don't have enough time for that ambush effect to pay off. If you have to play it in that situation, you may want to manually spring it. So because you need to have units on the board to benefit from playing this trap, it's another card that facilitates playing with the new spring mechanic rework. And because the boost values decrease whenever your opponent passes, that means the values you see starting off on the card are what you'll get in round 1, but if you wait to play this until round 2, then the values will go down by 1. If you wait until round 3, they'll go down by 2. So that means you definitely want to play Sticky Situation in round 1, and it could potentially be your main win condition for round 1, which I've always found a little bit tricky for traps in the past because generally you save Ordained for a huge point slam in round 3, which often meant that you'd need to be carried by your traps alone, maybe with the help of Saber-Toothed Tiger in round 1. So in that way, Sticky Situation should be a really nice addition to trap decks. Then we have the first of the new Scoia'Tael legendary cards, Angus Cree? Not sure how you're supposed to pronounce that. 7 power, 12 provisions, Elf, Bandit, Soldier, deploy. For the rest of the match, whenever you spawn an Elven Deadeye, boost it by 1. If your starting deck has at least 4 unique traps, this card starts in your hand. So basically, you want to play Angus in round 1, because every subsequent Elven Deadeye that you spawn will get a 1-point boost. Even by round 2, round 3, your Elven Deadeyes are still getting stronger, which, especially if you're planning to use Ordained in round 3, sounds like that is amazing setup. Because he'll start in your hand if you have at least 4 unique traps in your deck, you should have perfect consistency, always having the option to play him in round 1. The one issue I potentially see with him is obviously 12 provisions is a lot and 7 power is not great for 12 provisions, and since his value is mostly long-term, tempo-wise, he's definitely not that good. But with the help of the traps, particularly Sticky Situation, maybe that's still enough to get the job done in round 1. And like we said with the Trap Maker, trap decks are usually more about reducing your opponent's points with control rather than putting up a bunch of points yourself. Trap decks almost always use Deadeye Ambush as their leader ability, and with Angus, that is definitely going to be the case. Then finally, we have Reordain, our second and final legendary card for Scoia'Tael. 5 power, 13 provisions. He's an elf, bandit, soldier, and on deploy, if played adjacent to at least one trap, you'll play an elf from your deck, and if played next to an elf, you'll play a trap from your deck. So obviously, 5 points for 13 provisions is not a lot. So the key value comes from playing that 1 or potentially 2 additional cards. Because if you play Reordain in between a trap and an elf so that he is adjacent to both of those things, you will play both a trap and an elf from your deck, giving you 3 cards in one turn, and that can give you a lot of tempo. It doesn't say if that's a random trap and elf or if you get to choose, but if you do get to choose, then this is an incredible tutor, similar to Siggy from Syndicate, because you can play 2 cards from your deck in one turn. Once again, this is another card that facilitates playing the trap archetype with the new spring mechanic rework, potentially giving you multiple units to play in between your traps, making it much easier to get the ambush effects rather than the spring effects. One other noteworthy change to an existing card is that Ibier is getting completely reworked. He will now be 6 power, 6 provisions, and whenever you play an artifact, you will boost the lowest powered allied unit by 3. So rather than playing additional traps, he'll be an engine that boosts your units when you play traps, which is probably another small step toward making the trap archetype more reliant on units than it used to be. So what do you think of the new Scoia'Tael cards? Are you going to continue to play unitless trap decks, even with the spring mechanic rework? Or will you break out these new cards using more units than you had in the past? Traps have always been a very divisive archetype. Most people either love them or they hate them. Will you want to try it out with these new cards and embrace the changes to this archetype? Or does this still feel like more of the same? And what do you think it'll be like to play against trap decks that do play units, as that may fundamentally change many of Trap's matchups? Let me know what you think. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.